a new house, a new garden, and a new garden plan. And it doesn't happen overnight. So join me as I show you my process for planning and then building a garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening. Today, it's garden design, and specifically laying out the design that you've put on paper. Now, for months, I've been figuring out just exactly what my new garden should look like. In my previous video, I took paper, I took my ideas, I put the two together, and I came up with a general framework of where I thought the individual garden components should be. Well, this next step is to take those basic ideas and then actually go outside and see if they'll fit, if they'll work. I started by just walking across my yard with measured steps. This gave me a pretty good idea of how wide and how long my garden space was going to be. Now, your space might be bigger, it might be smaller, but the basic process can still be done. Walk across it, see how big it is, just to get an idea. And then you can come back into your garden plan and get an idea of what you might need to adjust. And I did a lot of that because my initial thoughts just weren't going to fit the way I thought they would. So after putting a secondary plan in place, I then went back outside for a more specific measurement. And for this, I actually took a long tape measure so that I could get very precise measurements end to end of the space that I was going to grow in. With the precise measurements, now you can come back and draw to scale. You can put all of the different components down onto your garden plan and have a much better feel for how they're going to fit. In my previous video where I talked about the bubbles and you just put general guidelines for the individual pieces, now with specific measurements I can see how they fit together. And so, for example, this patio space, earlier I thought it might only occupy a small space close to the house, but I'm realizing after walking it that I need a bigger space, and this actually pushes back my garden arch further into the garden. And now I also have decided that I want to put a pergola that will end up being pretty close to the center of the garden. So with these big structures on paper, I can now get a feel for how the rest of it fits together. So with this plan in mind and the space figured out, I actually brought in some heavy machinery to level my entire garden space and clear out some of the weeds and the plants growing on the surface that I wasn't going to need anymore. You don't necessarily need to bring in heavy machinery, but the concept is the same. Go ahead and clear out the garden space. Start with nothing, because from nothing you can build up and you can build out. Even in a very small plot where you're trying to figure out where the garden components will be, just clear everything out, because then you can start putting the individual pieces in place. You can stake, you can measure, you can start building some of those structures. I like to focus on the structures in the beginning of the layout process, because the structures will be the permanent parts of the garden. You can shift around pots and you can move beds, but if you put something like a formal archway or a pergola or a water feature, those tend to be permanent parts of the garden. And so everything else flows out from there. And that's what I'll actually start doing next, is going outside, identifying where some of those structures will be, and then figuring out the layout and the marking of these other parts of the plan. With the plan mostly finalized, now I'll be marking out the key parts of the garden. This is the center of my planned growing space. So I'm marking this, and then from here I'll be branching out with more stakes and trying to get an idea of what it's all going to look like. Now, this process doesn't have to happen overnight. For a very small plot, it might take a very short amount of time. But for me, in a large area that I'm putting together, it's going to take a much longer period of time. So I'm allowing this process to develop. I staked out the center of the garden and where the pergola would be, because that's a focal point. And from there, I expanded out. And I actually started putting some of the beds in place. You may have seen me constructing some of those beds. With that in place, now I can start laying out some of these other smaller components and deciding if they look right, if it's really going to fit. Now, this center part of the garden will be a hard structure. So it's important that the stakes identify the exact width, the size that it's going to be. But for this area of the garden, I'm using a hose. These are my blackberries and my raspberries, and I have it on paper how big I think it should be, but by laying out a hose, I can get a real good feel of the size. And the hose allows me to put some curves in it and modify the shape so I really get the best garden bed that I'm looking for. I've got a lot of garden space with a lot of hoses and stakes, but this concept can be brought down to the most basic garden. If you've got just a small space and you're not sure how big you want your bed or where you're going to put it, well, then pull out a hose and just lay it on the ground, add those curves, modify the size, and you can really get a good feel for what it'll look like after you start digging. In this area of the garden where I'm anticipating some new beds, I've actually put some mulch down just to get an idea of what it will look like. This is where my pergola is going to go, and it will be surrounded by these beds. It's just mulch, no plants. So if I don't like the look or I'm not pleased with the layout, I can always spread it around to get another look. That area identifies where the pergola is going to be, and the mulch is identifying the 4 fruit beds that will surround it. A little further down in the garden plan is this pathway that leads to the arch. Now, with my raspberries and flowers and espalier trees, I'm actually going to be cutting off access to this path. I'm a little concerned by that, so I'm going to lay out where I think it's going to go. I'm using logs and branches to identify the edge of that path. This isn't an exact alignment, and these aren't the materials that I'll be using. This isn't a permanent part of the path. It's just to identify that area where I'll be having my raspberries and my fruit trees and my flowers. And now over the course of the next few weeks, I can walk this path and see if it matches with the vision and what I have in my plan. Does this path lead to the vegetable garden beds as I imagine it? And does it feed into this archway that leads to the pergola that is surrounded by 4 beds loaded with fruit bushes? I think the garden is really coming along well. It's because I'm trying to stay as true as I can to this basic plan that I developed. Now, I've already made many modifications to what I initially put on paper to what is actually beginning to grow outside. Because as I laid out the hoses and the mulch and the logs, I started getting a better feel for what fits and how it flows. And so I can modify this plan any way I want to after I've put it on paper. This doesn't have to be the final product. For you, put it on paper. That's a great first step. But then when you get out there, do that same thing. Lay it out and see how it all flows, if it matches your vision. If it does, then you can start digging. You can start building. You can start making it more permanent. And that's what I'm doing. It's an evolving process. It will always be changing, but it starts with the plan on paper. If you have any questions about this or what I've shown you so far outside, please let me know below. And if you've followed a similar process, well then share that with me if you would. Or if you've done it differently, share with all of us what has worked for you, because I know all of us can benefit. If you want to see more of the videos in this particular series, subscribe to the GardenerScott channel and make sure you click on the bell, because some of the future videos will actually be showing the building of the garden that I have planned. If you like this video, you can give me a thumbs up and share it. I'm GardenerScott. Enjoy gardening.